This happened to me near my house in upstate Virginia in 2014 when I was around 40. It was the middle of fall and my wife had unfortunately died due to a heart attack a few months ago, and I was beyond devastated. She was the nicest woman you could ever meet and was always willing to help people no matter what circumstances. We had owned a log house deep into the woods in a rural area of Virginia, as we never liked the busy city, mainly because it was too crowded. The only time her and I would go into the city was for work or to go shopping. Anyway, after she had died, I had this house to myself, and it was my responsibility to take care of it, as it was pretty much the only thing that was relatively close to me. I'd wake up at the same time every morning to go to work, leave, go grocery shopping when needed, and go back home to take long walks. Walks were pretty much my only activity that I considered as fun, and taking walks in the woods is amazing, especially in the fall. I liked the cool fresh air while walking and looking at the brownish orange leaves as they fell from the trees. Overall, it gave you that autumn/winter vibe you get knowing that you're getting close to winter. One night, I had received an email from my work notifying me that it would be closed due to possible tropical storm warnings in the area. That email was a blessing in my case, which meant that I could have a day or two to myself without the constant hassle at work. I made a plan to go outside all day the next day and do the things I enjoyed: hiking, fishing, and possibly hunting if deer were around. The next day finally came, and I put on my shoes and casual clothes to go hiking for a few hours. There's a really long trail near my house that stretches across the forest, which is the perfect length for me. Fast forward to about 3 hours into the trail, I stopped for a rest break while sitting at a tree stump. I didn't know how it exactly happened, but as I was sitting, I managed to see what looked like another trail within this one that most likely led off deep into the woods somewhere. In fact, it was so well hidden that you wouldn't be able to see it unless you were really looking or knew where it was. I still had a good amount of water and some spare batteries for my flashlight in case it got dark, so I figured why not try out a new trail. I casually walked into the trail, not even thinking twice about it. Anyway, the trail was at first small with twigs and branches constantly hitting you in the face, but it then managed to become more clear. However, I had this weird feeling, like I shouldn't be there, and something was telling me to go back. I simply ignored these feelings and moved along the trail that ended up coming to a huge clearing. I have to admit, it was a nice empty space. No trees, no branches, just some tall grass that looked like a small meadow. At this point, I've been hiking for well over 4 hours and the sun was starting to go down, so I called it a day and proceeded to turn around. However, I then could see something out of the corner of my eye. I turned in that direction to see the outline of a structure with straight lines, and everyone knows that nature rarely makes straight lines. Upon further inspection, I realized that it's an abandoned treehouse deep into the woods. The treehouse was a decent size. It's not the kind you see made for children or anything. It was big and old and looked like it was big enough for someone to live there, but I knew that there was a slim chance of that as it was very old and run down. Needless to say, I walked closer and take a picture of it, as I do like taking pictures of abandoned structures. I then noticed an old wooden ladder with various broken steps leading up to the treehouse. I've always been a daring type of person to do things that others would think twice about, and at this point my intentions were to go up there and see what I'd find. Crazy thoughts immediately came into mind, thinking that I'd find a dead body or something frightening. I go up there without any hesitation and saw nothing. It was just an empty dark space with spiderwebs and some old beer cans that were once used. There was nothing interesting in here, and by now it was already dark out and I decided to call it a night. I'm walking away from the treehouse about 15 feet away from it when I hear a loud scream from somewhere in the woods. I could tell it was a male based on the pitch of the scream. It was honestly the type of scream you'd hear from a person who was psychotic. I ran for it, back into the direction where I saw the trail that would lead to my house. However, the problem was that I couldn't find it. It was so dark out, you couldn't even see where you were going without having a source of light with you. Thankfully, I remembered my flashlight and shined it everywhere, hoping to find this trail. All the while, I'm constantly looking behind me, thinking that someone would be there while trying to catch my breath. I don't know who that was, but I knew that they posed immediate danger. After about 10 minutes of me looking for the trail, I finally find it and practically run back toward my house and breathe a sigh of relief. After that, I go straight to bed while reading a book to keep my mind off at what just happened, and everything seemed to be going okay. I still kept a lookout for anyone near my house, but thankfully no one has ever came, and it's been 4 months now. The only problem is that treehouse is only 5 miles from my house. Before I begin with this story, here's a bit of background information. Back in July, I had broken up with my girlfriend due to her unfortunately cheating on me with another guy. Of course, like any boyfriend would, I got pissed off and wanted nothing to do with her anymore. She tried saying things like, "It's not what it looks like, I was lonely," and anything to make me believe that it wasn't her fault. However, I knew what she was trying to do, and I declared that I wasn't stupid and didn't want her in my life anymore. At the time, I was living in her house and I immediately moved out to go live with my parents as I wasn't financially stable to afford a place on my own. Fast forward to the middle of fall, my parents told me that they would be going up to New York to visit a friend of theirs for a week. Thankfully, classes happened to be canceled that week due to a Category 2 hurricane headed our way, so I'd have the house to myself. My parents had left me with some money for food and some in case of an emergency. For the first few days, I was busy preparing for the storm while trying to catch up on some studying as finals weren't far away. One night, I was in my room upstairs playing some video games when I hear a thud coming from downstairs. I paused my game while trying to identify the sound. I can't describe it exactly, but it sort of sounded like books falling on a rug in the living room. I dismissed it as it being something that probably fell, and that I would pick it up later. But that checked out when I heard the same noise again, this time a bit more clear. I paused my game once again and went downstairs to go see what it was. There, in the middle of the dining room floor, was a picture frame that had somehow fell. However, this particular picture was supposed to be hanging on the wall in the kitchen, so I was confused as to how it got here. I peeked into the kitchen and had the urge to scream. There was a man crouched down by the counter, and he was holding what I could only describe as a large crowbar. By some stupid luck, the man didn't see me as he was facing the opposite direction. I would like to mention that I'm pretty tall, about 6'5", and even though I was tall, I wasn't strong, so confronting him was useless, especially if he had a crowbar. I quietly tiptoed back to my room upstairs, trying my best not to make any noise, and thankfully I didn't. As soon as I got to my room, I locked my door, thinking of what to do. My dad had his hunting rifle in his closet, but the only problem was that I barely knew how to shoot, and I figured calling the police would cause too much noise. But in my situation, it didn't seem like I had a choice. I picked up my phone and dialed 911 and told the operator that there was someone in my house and that I needed police. All the while, she kept on telling me to stay calm and to find somewhere to hide if possible, and that the cops were on the way. There were not a lot of places to hide in this room, so I ended up going into my closet and covering myself with some clothes. The operator was still on the line with me, but like I said, I didn't want to make too much noise, so I decided not to talk. That's when I hear the sounds of footsteps coming up the steps. I whisper while panicking in the phone, "He's coming up the stairs." Once again, she told me to stay calm and to remain on the line with her. I heard him open my parents' door and then the bathroom door, and then eventually the footsteps stopped right outside my door. What happened next will never leave me. He started slowly knocking on my door, and he then said something along the lines of, "I know you're in here, bud." He then steps into my room, and I'm looking through the cracks of the closet, and he still had that damn crowbar with him. All of a sudden, he turns his head to the closet and begins walking over, but by some miracle, I begin to hear the sounds of police sirens in the distance. He begins to run down the stairs, and I eventually hear loud knocks at my front door, and thank God it's the police. I thank them for coming just in time, but the man was nowhere to be seen. he simply left through the back door. It turns out that my neighbor saw this man get into my house earlier that day with a key. My neighbor figured that it was a friend or someone who knew my parents, but that obviously wasn't the case. Needless to say, we moved out of that house a month later, as we couldn't stand the constant paranoia that we were being watched. I still have questions that are still left unanswered. How did he get a key to our house? What were his intentions? And what would he have done had the police showed up any later? That still freaks me out till this day. Okay, so just a heads up. I'm an 18-year-old female and I work at McDonald's in a rural part of Mississippi. My manager, being the jerk that she was, gave me a schedule full of night shifts. I hated working the night shifts mainly because I had classes early in the mornings and I couldn't afford to get dropped from them as it would affect my financial aid. Anyway, I was working one of the late night shifts till 1 a.m. and would be closing with my coworker, Greg. Greg was an amazing guy. You might as well consider him as a friend who would always be by your side. At around 11:30 p.m., my manager, who happened to be working that night, told me to take out the trash with an attitude. I rolled my eyes, and when I looked away, I proceeded to take the trash bags out of the garbage. I go outside, and as I'm walking to the dumpster behind the restaurant, I noticed that one of the lids was open. My first thought was that the other worker who took out the trash earlier that day had forgot to close it. I continue walking over to the dumpster and look inside to see a homeless man by the few trash bags. He wore a plaid t-shirt, had long gray hair that covered most of his face. At this point, I'm completely freaked out and I knew that my manager would argue with me if I didn't get him out of there. Trying to be polite as I could, I told him that he needed to leave and that he was trespassing on the property. Expectedly, he didn't say anything and just kind of stood there staring at me with a blank expression that made me feel really uneasy. I then turned around to see Greg walking toward me asking if everything was okay. I gave him the look not to come any closer and to go back, and he thankfully got the hint. We go back inside and I inform my manager about the guy in the dumpster. With her rude and unpleasant attitude toward me, she starts to babble on about how there was nothing to worry about and how he probably is harmless and just looking for some food. All of a sudden, Greg shouted at the top of his lungs telling us that the man was right outside the front door banging on the glass. This time, his facial expression went from normal to just angry and furious, and there was no apparent reason as to why. Just like that, he simply turned around and walked away, disappearing into the night, and it was thankfully time to close. Unfortunately, I didn't have a car yet as they didn't have money, so I took public transportation. Greg, being the nice person he was, offered me a ride back to my house to make me feel a bit more secure. I politely declined his offer and told him that I'd wait for the bus. Looking back, that was possibly the worst decision I've ever made. He then left and said goodnight, and I started walking to the bus stop, which was about a block away from the McDonald's, right by Bank of America. It was around 1 in the morning, and there were barely any cars out at this time. In fact, the only sound I heard was the slight hum from a dim streetlight. I sat there for what felt like hours waiting for this bus to arrive so I could just get home, but I then began to see something from the corner of my eye to the right. I look and see that it's the same man from earlier. It is very dark out, but the streetlights illuminated him, and I could see him staring at me with a smile I can't even begin to describe. I pretended like I didn't notice him, but I kept on noticing that he was getting closer to me as more time passed. I prayed for the bus to get here in time. 30 seconds went by, and he was now 10 feet away from the bus bench, still walking toward me. Thankfully, I began to see a pair of big headlights coming from down the road, and I was relieved to see the bus. I saw his hand reach for something in his back pocket, but I didn't want to see what it was. I got onto the bus and put my stuff down and looked out the window to still see him there, giving me that unsettling grin. Till this day, I still wonder as to what exactly he was reaching for in his back pocket. In 2006, my girlfriend and I went up to a small town in Utah to stay at a cabin my grandparents had owned. I loved going up there with my family, especially during the winter, as there were tons of things to do in the snow. However, her and I were going up there for a week during the fall, as our college thankfully had a fall break. When we got to the cabin, all the trees were filled with brown and orange leaves, and so was the ground. Once we had unpacked everything, we got settled in for the night by watching a movie in the living room and ate our pizza we had brought at a nearby shop. I'd like to mention that this cabin was practically in the middle of nowhere, deep into the woods, and I have to admit, it was a bit creepy being in the middle of nowhere, especially at night. Once the movie had finished, it was already 12 o'clock by now, and we decided to call it a night. My girlfriend fell asleep way before I did, as I do sometimes have trouble sleeping ever since I was a child. I, for whatever reason, looked outside the bedroom window to the tall lantern that was about 15 feet away from the cabin, and that's when I noticed something standing under it. It was hard to see, but I could make out the shape of a human silhouette standing still. I got up and went outside the back door to get a closer look, and then it became a bit more clear to me. From my perspective, it looked like a child standing there in the leaves, looking directly at me. My blood then ran cold, and I got out my phone ready to dial the sheriff, but I then heard the child laugh and then full on sprint into the woods, never to be seen again. I stood there, frozen in fear, and eventually went back inside, not saying a word to my girlfriend. I don't plan on ever going back up there anytime soon.